Now time to talk about Frederick the Great. Thank you to all my Patreons for voting on this topic, and also thanking Andrew for sending me this book from my wish list, which helped me out quite a lot. Now Frederick the Great and his time are actually quite controversial. Usually this time is called the age of limited war or limited warfare. Now this is very interesting because some authors actually make a difference between war and warfare, which makes sense, and I will do a video on this, whereas others basically completely refuse the term limited war because it makes no sense at all. So this is something I will discuss in a different video, but Frederick the Great is even more controversial. There are basically some that say he would have been in a madhouse if he wasn't the king. Others are very positive about him, others are very negative. There are few balanced views. And some also call Prussia at this point a kingdom of contradiction. Others go as so far to say, well, Frederick the Great, we can doubt about that or discuss this, but one thing is certain, he was Frederick the Lucky. So, as always, be very careful what you read, because I read many authors on this one, and everyone has a different view, and sometimes they align more or less, but in some cases there's just it doesn't add up very well. So also his general personality and his history is very, very contradictory, or very, very rocky, let's call it that. He's basically a dreamy kid at some point, runs away from his father, but he then gets imprisoned in a fortress for about 2 years, and one of his companions actually gets executed. And then you have the very strict and harsh mentality he had, and later on he's called the Alte Fritz, the old Fritz, a more benevolent leader. So there are very different aspects in his life, and he changed a lot over the period as well. Now let's look at the beginnings of Frederick the Great and also some of his characteristics. There was an Austrian who actually was at the Prussian court at one point, and he notes he will never be a Feldherr or a general. He will never be a field commander or a general in his lifetime, which, well, we know turned out rather wrong. And of course, as mentioned before, the incarceration by his father in a fortress made a clear difference. There was some kind of shift. Of course, we don't know if it was the incarceration or basically he matured to becoming older. And rather early on, he did you could say nowadays, you would say an internship at Prince Eugen von Savoyen, the commander who was central in the Battle of Vienna, and the Germans named the ship after it, the Prince Eugen, the heavy cruiser. Now, what is undoubtedly that Frederick the Great had a superior intellect, and he was reading all the time. He had his own field library. And he read Caesar, he read Charles XII of Sweden, better known as Carolus Rex. And after his military campaigns, he went back and did systematic studies based on his experience and took a closer look. And Frederick the Great was not undefeated in any battle. He several times faced defeat, and there were some various errors, especially early on, like rather unpleasant deployments, and he also, which is probably a German trait, he outran his supply lines a few times, and of course he adapted according to this. Now let's look at some trade and actions. Now, the military historian Robert Citino notes that what made up the German way of war to a certain degree was the combination of the aggressive commander and the intellect of the staff officer. And you could say with Frederick the Great, you have both in one. He has a strong intellect and he's also very aggressive. He's usually going for the offensive. Now, you could say this offensive, aggressive attitude was his personality, but you could also look at the greater picture and could say, well, it was actually necessary, as Showalter argues. Because Prussia and also Germany is always seen as the power in the center of Europe to a certain degree, or it's surrounded by enemies. And it has a rather weak economy at this point, and so the only way to be on the initiative is to be rather aggressive, especially if you look at Prussia in the 30 Years' War, where basically everyone walked over it. And this couldn't be done anymore. So in order to be on the initiative and not on the defensive all the time, you have to be rather offensive in your whole general layout and strategy. And Frederick the Great also was always about optimizing his army and his state. The organization of the army, selection of officers. He did yearly reviews. And he also did yearly education of his generals, and he was very focused on the replacements for proper training and education. Now for officers, he focused on ambition and performance. And he sent people he didn't consider good enough into pension to get rid of them, not have them in the army. So ambition and performance was very important for his officers. And the yearly reviews included information on that part so that he could decide on them. Now for NCOs, he basically said loyalty is the most important. Writing, the ability to write, is second. He doesn't want to have Federfechter, which could be translated to quill fencers. And for enlisted men, this is where you would say, this doesn't sound very enlightened. He said, for them, fear and loyalty is the most important. So they should fear the NCO, they should fear the enemy. And about his leadership capabilities, he could stay cool in crisis. Probably one of the best examples is that during a retreat in one battle, he was drenched in blood of his horse, and he still made an ordered retreat and brought everyone, or not everyone, but most people into safety. And he also put a very importance on administration, and basically he always improved everything based on the wartime experience. So everything he learned, he tried to apply as soon as possible for the army, for the state, and everything. This is also reflected in his writing. He did military writing on the principles of war applied for Prussia in terms of tactics and everything. This was written in 1748, but only the German version appeared in 1753, and it was only for generals. Now this is very interesting in many aspects. First, Frederick the Great considered German a lower language basically. Most of what he did was in French, which was not so uncommon at that time because French was the language of the courts. And the other very important thing here is that he wrote something for senior officers. At this time, usually everything that was written was for junior officers or below. So basically instructions and everything was written. This was intended for a different audience. And he wrote for senior officers, basically how to plan a campaign, how to organize properly supplies. He put a very strong emphasis on camp organization. And he basically had camps set up for defensive, but also in an offensive way, that they were placed rather close to the enemy to bring him under some kind of stress. Now the camp organization, the strong focus on this, some basically note the only ones that did it beforehand in this strong sense were the Romans. And there was a certain reason for this, because one of the main enemies of Frederick the Great were the Austrians. And the Austrians were rather well on the light troops on irregular warfare. So usually light cavalry or something harassing his troops. So he had to counter this because he wasn't particularly well on the light troop side, on the irregular warfare, because he was going mostly for a decisive stroke. So quite different. So you could say the Prussian fist and the Austrians, yeah, we are more, usually a bit more subversive. Another issue he focused very clearly on was mass desertion, and this was also related to supply. So here's some friction, you could basically say. He had to deal with mass desertion and desertions early on, and as such he watched his troops very closely. So to a certain degree, some would say he basically watched them like they were prisoners of war. But here's the problem: he usually went for fast deployments, he went for fast marches and everything. And if you watch everyone very closely, this becomes a problem. And these desertions were also due to a certain degree when supply problems came up. So he ordered basically provide the best supply as possible. And this is also very interesting. We need to take a look at the soldiers at that time. In the 30 Years' Wars, you had mainly mercenaries. And around the times of Napoleon, you have the early beginnings of national armies with more of a higher call, you could say, a call of duty or pride on this aspect. And here in the 18th century, we're somewhere in between. The soldiers are basically professionals employed by the state, not mere mercenaries, but they're also not soldiers that are bound too much to a nation. We should not forget that a large amount of officers were also coming from different countries at this point. So there was always this mix. So here one author argues that if you don't get supplied as a soldier, it's basically a breach of contract, and so you are more or less free to leave. Of course, you get punished if they catch you, but basically there's a different view of what is a contract, what's my job, what is my duty. You should not forget that this is a few hundred years ago. Values and perceptions and everything is very different at this point. So this probably would require several studies to make it completely clear. Now, back to the situation. He also wrote in his writings that it's very important to face war on its own territory and to establish various magazines. This is usually called the strategy of interior lines. So basically he could use his own magazines and his own infrastructure to move as fast as possible within his realm, whereas the enemies usually had to move to enemy territory and also along different lines. So here still the preference is always for him on the offensive, because he states, well, if we lose on the offensive, we still can go back to the defensive. So offensive first, and then only if necessary we do the defensive warfare. And on the strategic picture, he focused on quick wars because his army and infrastructure couldn't sustain a long war. Still, Prussia, weak economy, not a major power at this point, or not a great power, and so he had to focus on this. He had to work with his limitations. And he called this, the wars should be kurz and vives, short and lively, whereas vives is again more of a French word, not a German at this point. And he always focused on concentrating the army for a decisive battle. Again, this is in contrast to the Austrian approach, sometimes with more light troops. Now, for fortress warfare, he notes a limited amount because he wasn't particularly into fortress warfare for several reasons. First off, he didn't consider fortress and sieges very decisive, and he disliked them because they took quite a lot of time. Additionally, his troops and his training were all for an open field battle. So if he went into siege warfare, they were not suited for that. If you have an analogy, basically similar for the Wehrmacht in the Second World War, they were made for operational warfare and everything. They were not made for attrition warfare, so going into Stalingrad was a very bad idea. Similar here, Frederick, okay, fortress warfare, not particularly good. And he also gave instructions for his fortress commanders, basically hold out as long as possible if there's a relief force or the chance to win, but surrender early on enough that the troops can leave. Because usually back then, if a garrison surrendered, they were allowed to leave. So the troops could fight another day. Also, another aspect is that back then the Prussian, the Austrians and the Russians had rather bad engineer corps, which were very much required for proper siege warfare. And also it's a major strain on the supply lines again, which I was not really aware before, but at this point sieges require a lot of construction material to build the proper saps and everything. So yeah, siege warfare was also very costly in time, in supplies, material and everything. So it's completely contradictory to everything that the Prussian army at this point is organized for and good at. So he also notes that hunger is actually better than a battle. The problem is that a battle is usually required to force a decision. So he's always focused on forcing a decision to driving out an enemy as fast as possible from a war. Now it's also kind of necessary because some people will complain if I don't mention it. Basically on tactics, Frederick the Great is very well known for the oblique order. The oblique order is basically you focus your strength on one flank and drive the enemy down there, and then you wheel around and encircle him partially. One way to do this is the echelon formation, where everyone is displaced by a certain amount. But basically you don't need an echelon formation to perform an oblique order. So Centino, for instance, mentions, yeah, well, the oblique order is usually a bit overemphasized and not that important. We need to focus on the operational side, where he went for outflanking the enemy, outmaneuvering, being fast with his fast marches and everything. And on the strategic level, we usually have the strategy of the interior lines, as mentioned before. So if you have these three levels, tactics, operations, and strategy, you have these three elements where he focuses on mostly. Of course, there's some discussion which one is more important and what, for instance, was an oblique order attack or not, because there's also some, not that much of an agreement. It's quite interesting to see the different opinions. The ones say, okay, this was the first instance for an oblique order attack, and some say, well, actually, no, I don't think so. So always be a bit careful here. Now some final remarks here. Frederick the Great was considered by many as a very great general and a very interesting person, also especially on the military side, which some authors argue, well, this is due to his audacity, because everything he did, no matter if it's victory or defeat, it was rather impressive. So there's a lot of, you could say there's a lot of natural drama there. Then of course he had a strong focus on speed, fast marches, rapid deployment, basically catch the enemy unprepared if possible, mentally during his deployment or facing the wrong direction, which was sometimes the case in battle. They deployed so rapidly that the enemy was, in one case, the enemy was still at his camp, and in other ways he outmaneuvered them and he came completely from the flank because the enemy couldn't see what was going on, and sometimes also because they were mentally not prepared for facing his armies that early, because he did marches that were extremely fast. This comes with the other aspect, being very on the offensive, so the enemy was on a constant fear of being attacked. And another aspect which many people point out is that he used operations and tactics to solve strategic or grand strategic problems, which for him worked out, but some authors argue this was seen by the Prussians and also later by the Germans as a recipe for victory, but a very shaky one. And some argue that in the Second World War and also in the First, this aspect ran out because the strategic aspects of production, of industry, of manpower and everything become overwhelming, that the German way of war, or the focus on short wars, quick wars, focused on operational level, couldn't be sustained anymore because the numbers were too overwhelming. So basically, it doesn't matter if you win on the tactical and operational level all the time, if in the end, if you bleed your army dry. So some say, well, it started with Frederick the Great. Some, of course, probably disagree, but this is very, very important if you look at Frederick, that sometimes, the term Frederick the Lucky definitely applies, but as some author notes, he is still Frederick the Great. So I hope you enjoyed this first glance at Frederick the Great. Big thank you to all my patrons here, especially Andrew. Thank you for watching and see you next time.